By popular request, here is a tutorial rehash of the demo that I did in class about making using Keyshot to fake depth of field. I'm also going to show you a couple of little post-render tricks that I like to use to make my renderings pop. So we're going to be starting with this SolidWorks model. Some of you have seen the sketches. I just went ahead and modeled it. It's only about halfway done, but it'll serve our purposes. I'm going to switch my display state here, and now this is the version that I've colored in. The different colors will allow Keyshot to identify the different bodies, which will allow me in Keyshot to apply different materials. Most of you probably know this. If you're new to Keyshot, I'd recommend watching some of the widely available Keyshot intro basic tutorials. Because, and I just updated Keyshot, maybe by the time you're watching this, it'll be fixed, but as of, what's today? The 29th of April, Keyshot still doesn't have native support for SolidWorks files. So you have to save it as a step file. I mean, there are other options. I like step because it retains the colors. And once you have it saved as a step file, you'll be able to import it into Keyshot. I've already set up this scene and applied materials, two things I'm not going to cover in this tutorial because, again, it's very easy to find out how to do that. So this scene contains, as you can see, a little ground plane that I've made. It's worth doing this because having something in the background rather than the default of your object floating in space, even though you still get your shadows and reflections without it, I like to add that ground plane as a physical object because it gives us one important advantage when we're doing depth of field, which I'll explain a little bit later on. When you're setting up your camera for your view, it's important to pick one where, if you're going through this process, where depth of field is actually going to make a difference. So if we have a top-down view like this, most of the object we're looking at is equidistant from our camera. But if we go a little more extreme and look up or down at this from somewhat close on, now the view between the camera and, say, this point on the radio is like half or a third of what it is from the camera to this point on the radio. That's where depth of field is going to give us a more dramatic result. As things are close and far away, we can pick a focal point and then blur everything progressively as it is further away from that focal point. So once you have your camera set up and selected, let's just pick camera 3, sure. It's time to render. The important thing to select here, I like to use Photoshop PSD format. And because I have this backdrop on, including the transparency isn't going to make a difference, so I'll leave that unchecked. But what you should use is right here under layers and passes, check off depth. With depth selected, you go ahead and hit render. I've already done the renderings. You'll end up with two outputs. One, the name you give your file, and then another, the name you give your file with an underscore that says depth. This is a map in terms of, it's like a grayscale map of how far away different parts of the geometry are from the camera. So first things first, I'm going to open up the diffuse, which is to say the colors, the actual thing we want to look at. Next, you don't have to do them in this order, but it is important that you open them separately. See, as I drag this file in here, I've got this gray box around my currently active document. If I let go, it will drop the depth map on top of this like an image. I don't want that. Instead, I'm going to make sure that I've dragged it up here so that it says copy. When I let go, it's going to open it as a separate file, and it's asking me, do I want transparency or alpha? We'll leave it as transparency and hit OK. Oh, that's the wrong one. Bear with me for just a moment while I grab the correct depth map. Sorry, I did a couple of versions of this. Go away. There. All right, so we've got two files. One is the object, and the other is a depth map, which, I mean, if you're seeing what I'm seeing, looks pretty uninteresting. The cool thing about this is that it's a 32-bit document, which means it contains more information about light and dark than the human eye is capable of seeing, or indeed that our monitor is capable of displaying at one time. We can still access this information if we make some adjustments to this image. So what I'm going to do is click on, within the depth map, I'm going to click on Image, Adjustments, HDR Toning. You can also achieve a similar result by using the exposure tool, but I find that sort of picky and inconsistent. The nice thing about HDR toning is that if you change it from local adaptation right here where it says method, change it from adaptation to equalize histogram, it automatically compensates the exposure to produce an even percentage of lights and darks within the scene. Maybe percentage isn't the right word, but I think you can see the effect that it's having. All this information was hidden until we adjusted it with HDR toning. What we're looking at is a ghostly grayscale view of our rendered object. These light and dark values came from Keyshot measuring the distance between all these points in the image to the camera. So the closer something is to the camera, the darker it is. The further away something is, the lighter it is. We can use these values as a mask, or an alpha channel more specifically, which will control the intensity of a blur filter. That'll be explained or made more clear in just a moment. But back when I mentioned that it was not worthwhile to check off the include alpha because we have this backdrop on here, the reason that it's important to have the backdrop is because if you don't have a physical object, a piece of geometry on top of which or behind which your model is presented, this alpha channel, this depth map, will just be a cookie cutter shape of your object and then black everywhere else, or I should say white. But what's important is that we have this grayscale image that continues beyond our object. That's going to make the application of the depth of field a lot more smooth. We won't get any jagged edges where the filter ends. So again, just to rehash, I'm a big proponent of placing a piece of geometry behind or around or under your model. So now that we have this prepared, I'm going to hit Control-A, Control-C to copy this image. Then I'll switch back to my rendered image. And here's the tricky part, so pay attention. It's not tricky, it's just easy to miss. I'm not going to paste this into my image in the normal location. I'm not going to just drop it into my scene like that because that doesn't get me anything. Instead, I'm going to paste it in channels. So right here, layers, channels. If you don't have that open, go Google it or find your Windows or something. You need to be able to access your channels. So right now, the channels are showing the 3 different colors, red, green, and blue, that come together to make the complete image. I'm going to add a new channel, which default is named Alpha 1. That new button is down here. And then I will hit Control-V and paste the depth map here in Alpha 1. Next, I'm going to click RGB to change my display back to the pretty image. But Alpha 1 is just chilling out. It's there, but we can't see it. But the important thing is that Photoshop can use it to do what we're going to do next. One thing I do like to do is holding the Alt key, just drag the image down to make a copy of it. So now I have 2, and I'll just hide 1. That way I can quickly check before and afters to see the effects that my changes have had. Now, with the top one selected, Filter, Blur, Lens Blur. Now, yours may say something else, but because I've done this before, it's stuck on Alpha 1. The first thing you're going to do is go to Depth Map, Source, Alpha 1. That's telling this blur filter to use as a reference, as a map, the alpha channel that we've just pasted. So now Photoshop can use that light and dark value to change how it applies this blur filter. If we had no depth map, no alpha channel map in there, it would just be blurring the entire image altogether. But by clicking in different points of the image, Photoshop will make note of where I clicked. It will reference the alpha channel and say, okay, say he's clicking in like a light or a dark area on that alpha channel, meaning close or far away. If I click on this very far away point, it will be in focus, and you can see the blur filter is very heavily applied on this end of the model. So now you can sort of click around. We're not changing anything. We're just telling Photoshop which part of the alpha channel we want to be in focus and which parts we want to be blurry. Doesn't matter how many times you click, it always references the last place you click and changes the focus to adapt to that. So I'm going to focus on something close, like this corner. For a nice dramatic view, these details are sharp and crisp, and these details are sort of blurry and hazy. You can affect the intensity by changing this number here, radius. The larger the number, the greater the effect. Let's leave that at 50. Oh, not 560. There we go. Cool. Once you're happy with it, and do play around, hit OK. And it will apply the filter to your layer. Now, I'll turn on my copy layer and quickly switch back and forth, and you can right away see the effect that our blur tool has had. So that's the quick and easy way of applying depth of field. Now I'm going to show you one or two little tricks that I also like to use. On this layer, I'm going to use my favorite Photoshop tool of all time, which is called Camera Raw Filter. Shift-Control-A. Click that. And this gives me most of the same suite of tools that I use while editing raw photos from my camera. This is sort of a one-stop shop for anything you might want to do in Photoshop. And I find it's really powerful for tweaking colors and editing light and dark areas. So say I want some of these very dark areas to be picked up a little bit. I can increase shadows. Maybe I'll decrease blacks to compensate. And this swap before and after settings, the two little arrows in one box, you can click those to quickly go back and forth between your original settings and your modified settings. There's a lot of really neat stuff you can do in here, so play around with it. One other tool I like to use in here is up over here, HSL Grayscale. You have hue, saturation, and luminance controls broken out per color channels. What do you got? 8 channels here? Yeah, 8. So say I'm not happy with this green color. I can go to hue and change my greens. Say we'll go for a more of a deserty kind of appearance. And maybe I think this red switch was a mistake, and I want to darken that up, maybe even take that red away. Saturation, red, I'll drop it down. Luminance, which is like brightness, I'll go darker as well, maybe lighter. So you can see the effect that that has. And again, swapping before and after, I was able to make like huge sweeping changes to the color of this model without having to mess around with it in Keyshot and without having to use multiple filters back out in the Photoshop environment. This is great for doing like multiple color options. If you wanted to do a rendering, say I was presenting this to a client in 4 different colorways, I can use these tools to make quick tweaks. So again, before and after views, before and after. So that's how I use the Keyshot Depth image to change the appearance of the rendered image. While you're messing around in Keyshot, play around with some of these other interesting passes. For example, shadow and ambient occlusion are useful, pulling out some of the smaller details in your model. And just to illustrate that, go ambient occlusion. I'll open that the same way I opened my depth map. And here we can see it's just the only information in this image are shadows that the object casts upon itself. Control A, Control C, copy that. I'll drop it on top of this image. And while this doesn't look particularly promising, I will change the layer blending from normal to multiply. Oops. Thank you, multiply. And now I'll zoom in to say this area. If I turn the ambient occlusion layer off, you can see what happens there. Ambient occlusion is adding sort of a second copy of all of these little areas where it might be self-shadowing, which is a great way to add detail. So watch tutorials, play around. If you see something, click on it, experiment, see what it does. If you get stuck, consult the internet or me. But there's a lot of fun tools at your disposal here, and I'm sure you can find a better way to do this than I've even presented here. But keep experimenting. If you have any questions, let me know. Happy rendering.